So new here behind me with our canning line is a complete overhaul and upgrade. We've essentially doubled its capacity for producing cans. It's an American-made machine made in Boulder by a company called Wild Goose, and they have grown alongside the American kind of craft beer revolution. And when we first purchased this canning machine 5 years ago, we were the first ones in the state, and since then they've sold thousands more machines across the world, and they've really innovated the way small manufacturers like ourselves can package our product. So when we can beer, the first thing that happens is we drive a pallet of empty cans into this red box here, which is the depalletizer. Each pallet holds about 8,800 cans. They're empty, and then they have no lids on them, and they go into the machine. They go up, and then the cans then go onto a conveyor belt of about 20 or 30 at a time. And then they come down through the twist rinser. And so this way the cans are being fed into the machine by gravity, and so instead of an individual person. And so they get a quick rinse, they hit the conveyor belt, they come through here, and those tubes go down inside the can, and they put in a quick burst of CO2. And then they fill from the bottom, and they pull up by filling while they're pulling up. And so that top has that bed of CO2 on it with no oxygen getting in there. The next step is right here beneath that tube of paper, and then that's where the lids go on. So the lids are gently put on top of the can. The next step is in here where this rotor and machine is. It spins the can at a high RPM, and then those two arms touch the top of the can, one and then the other, to seal and then crimp that lid. And then they come out the back onto another conveyor belt where the six-pack toppers are put in. So you'll have 6 cans that show up in this machine, and then the six-pack toppers come on, and then they come out the end. So that whole machine here is a new addition as well. And what that does is allows us to run the entire operation with 2 people and make sure that our other employees are able to be out in the field doing kind of the important work of growing the business and being in the community. So this year we've added, most recently we added an 80-barrel bright tank. So this tank here is a brand new tank. It's 17, 18 feet tall, holds 80 barrels of beer. And for us to think about it in terms of like your sort of standard keg, that would be like 160 of your really large kegs. And this tank, for us, it allows us to reach further into the state by finishing more beer at once. So we can finish an entire 2 batches here, sometimes of lager, IPA, pale ale. And this is where the beer conditions cold. This is where we carbonate the beer. And then from these tanks, we push them either into cans or kegs or our canning line. And this is a lager tank, which allows us to condition and lager, which is German for to store cold. Lager is a verb to lager a beer. And in this tank, we take the Ozark lager, which is many people's favorite beer in the state. And this beer, in any one of these tanks, but mostly the lager tank, this is where that beer does most of its fermentation, right here. This here is one of the largest components of our most recent expansion. And again, we couldn't have done, we don't do any of this without the demand for it. So we have always tried to grow slowly alongside demand. And this kind of upgrade doesn't make sense at a smaller scale, but at the scale of demand that Arkansas is asking for us to meet that consistently, we needed a centrifuge. This machine is custom designed in Germany, and what it does is it separates the organic materials that are left in the beer after the process. So we used to use a filter, and with a filter, you have a good product, but you end up losing quite a bit of beer in that process. With the centrifuge, that organic material spins at a very high rate of speed with the beer, and all the leftover hop particles, yeast, and grain go off to the side, and they're ejected out the bottom periodically. So what we're getting is a more clear, more consistent, and higher quality product, and we're getting more of it because less of it is waste at the end of the day. So and a lot of folks ask, between the kettle, the centrifuge, and the newer tank, what does growth look like beyond this in Arkansas? Because for the longest time you didn't see craft beer, and now having seen a lot, it can appear that maybe there's not much more room for growth. When we see the opposite, we see a lot more room for growth in craft beer as more consumers transition to local products in their overall habits. They begin to fold in craft beer into that. As more people drink less of the macro beers that are maybe brewed to standards that don't match their own, they're coming away from those large large format beers they've drunk forever. So when people ask us, is there room for growth? Are we maxed out? We always say there's absolutely room for growth. We're not maxed out. What that looks like, we don't know. So for us, it's important to grow behind that demand instead of trying to create that demand. We try to stay with it, and that's one of the most difficult things in running a business like this, is not trying to get left behind, but not trying to get ahead of it as well. So